Welcome to our discussion today of John Donne's Scotus, who's probably most famous for his discussion of being. In many ways, this is derived out of a much larger debate, which we will talk about a little bit here today, and kind of reaches all the way back to issues with Bonaventure and others, and understanding God as the ground of being, and therefore, how do we understand the notion of being in general?
Moving on to the life of the subtle doctor, John Duns Scotus, 1266 to 1308. He's a Scot born in Duns, a village 8 miles north of England, and he was born somewhere between December 23rd, 1265 and March 17th, 1266. He's born in the town of Duns, and it's likely that his last name, his family name, is actually Duns as well. Scotus, once again, is generally applied to those people who are Scottish, and while earlier on in the millennia, any sort of Scotus could have applied to an Irishman as well as a Scotsman, at this point it's pretty firmly just referring to those people who are Scottish. So we kind of know a little bit about where he is with this, as opposed to the other John Scotus, Gina, who we had spoken about before, who is more likely Irish than Scottish, but at that time the distinction wasn't as important as it is now. As a boy, he learned grammar and was groomed to become a Franciscan. His uncle was actually a Franciscan and the guardian of the convent at Dumfries, so this is where he would actually go as an adolescent and join. In 1279, he likely became a novice, though other sources say that this happened later. The general rule is you need to wait until you're at least 15 years of age to take any sort of orders. But this doesn't mean that that is when you're entering into the house as a sort of pre-novice. You can't officially become a novice usually until you're 15, but a lot of times you might enter those houses earlier. So this is probably what happened with him. He was ordained to the priesthood on March 17th, 1291. And likely he was taken there by two other Scottish Franciscans from this house to Oxford. Exactly when and how long is also still a little bit of an issue of debate. While at Oxford, he became a Franciscan himself, not just a novice, and some sources say that he then went to Paris in 1292 for roughly 4 years. He then likely returned and went to Cambridge after going to Paris, and this is in part due to the war that is happening between England and France, which prohibited English students from crossing the Channel. So he's gone from Oxford to Paris to, at this point, really it's Oxford Junior at Cambridge, kind of the annex school, which of course no one from Cambridge would like to say today, but is largely the way that it was being treated. And he then likely returns back to Oxford in 1298, so he will go back there. While at Oxford, he will of course lecture on Lombard sentences, though he doesn't become a master while at Oxford. He, though not a master, does gain a good reputation. He is then once again sent off to Paris in 1302. Some sources put this at 1303, but largely it doesn't matter between the 2 years. And it could actually be the exact same date that's being discussed, but different years, as there are different ways people are dating years at this point. The sort of custom that's being done for most of the people in the greater Gaul area in the French regions is to date New Year's with the Feast of the Annunciation, which is March 25th. So this becomes the New Year's, and then of course the end of March might sometimes be still counted with the previous year, or it might be placed onto the next, but it's the Annunciation that is seen as the beginning of the new year. Germans will later kind of take this on and evolve it to being April 1st, which is where we're going to get our April Fool's Day sort of notion of mocking those people who still hold that the New Year's is in April. Traditional Roman dating for the beginning of the year is actually on September 1st. Ecclesially, for most church calendars, this is the actual official beginning of the new year, at least until we get the adaptation in the West of the Gregorian calendar, moving away from the Julian calendar, which had dated September 1st as the first day of the year. Anyway, interesting sort of trivium about dating aside, really the struggle between Boniface VIII and King Philip IV kind of caused an extra rift for Scotus in his own life. He will actually side with the Pope, and as such will get briefly exiled from France. The exile is generally regarded as very brief, probably into the space of either a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and will return back before the end of 1304. We know at that point that he is definitely back. Eventually, he will go off to Cologne, where he will, somewhere around the fall of 1307, and we know that he's definitely there by February of 1308 because he died there at the age of 42. It took a much longer period for Scotus to be beatified. This doesn't happen until John Paul II will declare Scotus a saint on March 20th, 1993. So there's actually a large gap between his death and his beatification. We have a lot of issues concerning his works because of his early death. None of his works are actually finished in their entirely finished way. Again, there is this general sort of notion that most of your works you will be slowly kind of fixing and tweaking throughout your tenure as teaching, and your works aren't generally finished until you think that you've decided it's done, it's good enough, I'm not going to play around with this one anymore. So a lot of them are started and will have notes in the side, and then you kind of go back and you correct something and you slowly sort of evolve works, many of which at the same time over your entire tenure teaching, which is of course a sort of monumental task. But while you're teaching a class, you'll hear a comment from a student and you know modify it and kind of go back and play with it and do this sort of thing. And so most of his works are all in a state of redactions and corrections. His students will also hastily assemble them together upon his death, and many of which are shuffled together where parts are inserted where they shouldn't be, and some notes are from a page are incorporated into the text, and it makes it really a little bit of confusing. And it wasn't until about the 20th century, between 1915 and 1923, that his works were cleaned up by people like Pelzer, Longpre, Baltic, and others. So his most important work is, of course, the Ornatio, also known as his Oxford Commentaries on Lombard Sentences. He does have a host of other works as well. He has Parisian commentaries on the sentences as well as his Oxford commentaries. These are seen as separate works. He has a Disputations, several of these, and the Tractatus de Primo Principio, which is a compendium of natural theology. He likely would have produced more works had he not died so early, and his works would have probably been cleaned up and his system would have made a little bit more sense as you are all approaching it. The most impactful philosopher during the University of Paris, and let alone probably throughout the rest of the 13th century, is Henry of Ghent. His impact is really in this last quarter of a century. So if we're wanting to place him in the 14th because it's largely after 1277, that would make sense. But he also dies in 1293, so it's really hard to identify him as a 14th century philosopher for many. Now, many of you might not remember Henry of Ghent or think only vaguely of him. We had just addressed him with the condemnations of 1277 against Aquinas, and he was a part of Bishop Tempier's panel, which condemned Aristotle et al. And Henry really will continue his importance after this event. The condemnations against Aquinas become the sort of launching pad for his career at the University of Paris. And he's really the last amongst the secular clergy to have any significance for quite a long time, as the mendicant orders take over even while they're waning with their own importance. He is intellectually an Augustinian. And this is important for our discussions here because his impact is upon Aquinas and the later reputation of Scotus, and he's really trying to check them within the understandings of Augustinian notions and where you're going to construct these. He really tried to make sense of the shifting nature of the later part of the 13th century through combining Aristotle and Augustine himself, even though, again, he is criticizing many of the Aristotelians and was charged to do so. He's a very important figure in the further discussion over the doctrine of the univacity of being. We see a very similar notion of univocity of being with unicity of form. These are two interrelated ideas, and we are familiar with unicity of form in its condemnations of 1277 and its relation with Aquinas. And this is really the issue for Aquinas that gets him in trouble with Ghent and with others. Unicity of form applies to all substances composed of matter and form, and it may be formulated thus that whether in one individual remaining essentially one, there is many substantial forms or only one form. For univocity of being, it's the idea that the word is describing the properties of God would mean the same thing when they are applied to people or things. Whether or not the term being can apply to God and to man and to your couch in the same way, or whether or not the term being really between God and creatures needs to be different. The key distinction between these two notions is that one is applied to all substances, excluding God, unicity of form, while the other is to God, excluding all other substances. For some, this becomes a notion of being in that discussion that needs to be there. Right? This is a very subtle distinction for the subtle doctor, Scotus, who we will talk about in a moment. And really the distinction actually flows from Bonaventure, a name that we had not expected maybe in this, and his theory of illumination, which we addressed in his Journey of the Mind into God earlier. For Bonaventure, God is the first thing that is known, even if we are not really aware that we are knowing God in the sensible world. Right? We saw this in the first step on the ladder to God, with the second step being recognizing God in the sensible world. First we see the world, then we recognize that God is in the world. And this is the notion of being and illumination of the world through this that Bonaventure talks about in the Journey of the Mind into God. In step 2, we already mentioned that we see hints of Al-Farabi, and this idea is developed even more with Avicenna, who said that being, thing, and something are the first things impressed upon our intellect. So we see definitely the use of this Arabic philosophy in addition to Aristotle, as applied by Bonaventure on talking about the being in relation to God and the sensible world. Now, obviously, Avicenna and Al-Farabi and Bonaventure each have their own distinct positions, which we've already talked about before, about what can be known with God or from the sensible world. Henry of Ghent's answer to this is a bit confusing. Actually, his answer literally is confusing. Henry takes this and says that at first we think that everything is a being, a thing, a something, and that when we say that such and such a being, we believe that we are affirming being according to the same meaning of every subject of which we predicate it. As such, for Henry, the term is being literally confused. Literally fused. We're taking two concepts and we force them together where there is in reality nothing in common between God and creatures that would allow for us to claim a concept that could be applied to both. Fairly similar to what we will see later with people like Barlaam of Calabria with his extreme apophatic theology, which is seen as normative in the West later on. But we will see that for Henry, God is a being and Socrates as a being. While we use the term being, we use it differently. We don't really mean to say the same thing as applied to both. Socrates is limited in his being, while God is not. And so this term being is one that we are confusing with our notions of God and Socrates or man or anything else. We have two different concepts, one being divine being and one being creaturely being, and that these are different. Following Bonaventure, Henry advances the idea of illumination. Here, God's being is a light that illuminates us, while we are not aware of God as the illuminating source at first, very much within this same sort of vein as Bonaventure. We also have the knowledge of creaturely being. Here we know the source and subject of our knowledge of its being already, mainly within the creature and with our own understandings of ourselves. Scotus doesn't really like this and has his own answer to this question. He didn't like the illumination theory of Bonaventure when applied to the Univacity of Being, or against application of it having its basis in a confusion in the part of man and being in relation to God. Being is a concept here for Scotus that can be predicated of both God and creatures, as it does not necessarily include in its definition modes of being. For God's mode of being is a separate mode than man's. So we have a different sort of mode. God is infinite and man is finite. And this is going to be an important sort of distinction. Here we have a concept that is common to both God and creatures, while still leaving room to deny that there's anything truly in communion or in common between God and creatures over this term of being. I.e., we have a common nature of being, but it is qualitatively different as finite and infinite. Scotus then maintains that there is a univocal common concept of being. Otherwise, there is no legitimate way to speak about God. And we'll see people like Barlaam of Calabria will fall into this trap, that otherwise we don't really have a way of speaking about God if we don't have at least the notion of being in common. Now, while Scotus is a Franciscan, that doesn't mean that all Franciscans fall in line. After all, he is questioning the notion of divine illumination that is held up by Bonaventure, probably the most important Franciscan after Francis, and likely ever, though we do get people like Scotus and Occam who might kind of jump into this sort of notion. But we have a large number of Franciscans who don't agree with the leading Franciscan at this point, Scotus, on this doctrine of Univacity of Being. Peter Aroli is among one of those. He maintains that Scotus ends up making being into a genus, at which point then man or God becomes subspecies or species of the genus, right? You know, from your basic discussion on taxonomy, categories that apply to animals, that is the same sort of notion that is being brought about or interpreted by Scotus's notion. So what does the genus of being then add? What is it really? Is there anything then in being, or is it just then a category? And this is a very easy question to kind of throw into this sort of notion. And Aristotle himself actually brings this up in Book 3 of the Metaphysics when he rejects the idea that being could be a genus. This is because the differences that are necessary to explain the different kinds of being must themselves be being. For Aristotle, being is said in many ways, but it is a term, not a definitive meaning, but only of analogy, and the analogy often used is the notion of health. Different beings are called healthy then as they relate to different things. One is the concept of healthy, rather is to be said is a different as an accidental quality of a thing, and therefore being is not an accident, as it were, or if so, then it doesn't really apply to our discussion and can be discarded. Aroli's Aristotelianism and his interpretation states that healthy things points to a formal presence of health in the creature, diet, complexions, etc., are not formally healthy. Rather, these are all predicates of a being and not a being. Right? If you're not there, then obviously you're not healthy. Healthy is of a different quality than the nature of being, one being an accident and the other's not. Now, at kind of the heart of this is that Aroli actually likes the concept of unity of being, but not in the same way that Scotus does. And so there's this sort of tension of, I don't like the idea, but I like parts of it. So how do I maintain this? And we can kind of see this with a little bit of the confusions of Peter Aureli's writings within this. As a result, Scotus ends up launching his own reply. A distinction clearly needs to be made. The concept of being that includes God and creatures is absolutely simple for Scotus. We cannot break it down into determinable elements and determining elements, common being and a concept of what is ultimately determinable in beings. Likewise, the ultimate differences are also simple. They are a concept of what is determining in beings. As such, all concepts are reducible to concepts that are either determinable, common, univocal concept of being, or determining, ultimate differences. These are irreducible, determinable, and determining concepts have nothing in common with one another. There is no common concept predicable in the same way of everything that is knowable. There is a relationship between a quantitative being, that which contains the essence of the thing, and a qualitative being. And so this is also another sort of relationship that we need to understand, that which contains the essence and that which qualifies it. This is a similar distinction to what Aquinas has stated between act and potency, essence and existence, but now being applied to God as well with Scotus. And so we can kind of see Scotus continuing within this sort of Aquinas Thomistic vein and just going a little bit farther, maybe to the point that Aquinas would have also rejected. For Scotus, this is necessary. Otherwise, we would deny the certitude of any and every proposition. Right? Univacity also allows us the ability to find an adequate object for our intellect to approach God. Since our intellect must have an object of which it comprehends, we must have some being to which we can approach when we are contemplating God. This does run the risk of being rather too Platonic, where we must have a thing which exists in the ideas, in the realm of ideas first, and this is not an idea that Scotus will ultimately want to take. Following Scotus, it's about being and not about ideas. And this doesn't move it over to the Aristotelian category exactly either, because being is an idea in many ways, right? So it's not about the matter or the material world or the sensible world, but it's about the concept of being in itself. For Scotus, being is simple unicity, uncomplicated by differences or properties. It is a unity of one single meaning. It maintains that God is approachable and knowable, but is still transcendent. And so this is the important distinction for Scotus. He needs to maintain the transcendence of God, where God is beyond and God is infinite, but he's wanting to also make God something that can be known. Otherwise, we can't know anything about God, and we're going to fall into the trap of people like Avicenna and Averroes, who is talking only about us learning from the previous spheres and can't actually know the source or God themselves, and God becomes something sort of distant and remote, and really just kind of the first mover amongst an Aristotelian sort of model. And so this is the tension that Scotus is trying to fix with his work. In addition to his discussion on the doctrine of univacity of form, Scotus is also argued on many other important issues for the Catholic Church and doctrines that will move beyond this, including the Immaculate Conception of Mary and the necessity of the Incarnation, even if Adam did not sin. The latter discussion is found in his Parisian commentaries on the sentences 3, distinction 7.4. He says, "To think that God would have given up such a task had Adam not sinned would be quite unreasonable. I say therefore that the fall was not the cause of Christ's predestination, and that no one had fallen, neither the angel nor man. In this hypothesis, Christ would have still been predestined in the same way." Here, what he's arguing is that Christ would want to become incarnate for other reasons, not just for the notions of redemption. And this is not a new idea with Scotus. You'll actually find this sort of idea argued within a lot of patristic writers as well, that it's more about the redemptive act and the union than just overcoming the sin, but the fullness of what we would see as redemption, and not just the idea of overcoming the sin in the fallen state or the notion of death, but it's to open for full union between God and man. He also will have references to the Immaculate Conception, as mentioned earlier. Here he will state that the criticism brought up by many was that if Mary had indeed been born immaculate, then she wouldn't have sinned and would have been incapable of sin. Then why would she need a redeemer? Oddly enough, in the act of bearing God and being kept from sin to do so, she doesn't need God in the same sort of way. So what is going to be the solution at this point here? He says that Mary was redeemed by Christ before her conception, and that this redemption then preserved her. This is the doctrine known as preemptive redemption, and Scotus is the one who will advance this, and this is generally an argument that is used by many Catholics still to this day. He will disagree with Aquinas on the issue of the will. For Aquinas, the will always chooses the good, as we have discussed already. Again, with Aquinas, it's not always the highest good, but we're always willing towards goods. For Scotus, the condition of the will is simply not the good or knowledge of the good, but it is simply just the will in itself. And so for Scotus, we actually have a much more free will than we will with Aquinas. We can freely choose the bad, knowing it is the bad, and not just choosing it because there is some good, light, beauty, truth, etc. found within it, as Aquinas will hold. Scotus is also not recognized as a doctor during the medieval era, even though he had more followers than Aquinas at the universities, especially as we move throughout the 14th century. His followers were known as duncemen, and this is shortened to dunces. And these, of course, are being mocked as fools during the early Reformation period by people like Erasmus and Luther, who viewed Scotus with the greatest disdain. This is one of the reasons for the growth of Thomism following the Enlightenment, as opposed to Scotism, is because of this reputation that is done by the Germans and the products of the Northern Renaissance, who refer to, of course, anyone who follows Scotus as a dunce. Even the dunce cap is usually kind of typified after the hat that you will usually see Scotus wearing as well. It becomes a little more pointed instead of round, but that becomes the sort of symbol that we will see later for the dunsmen.
One of the distinct advantages we have in addressing the philosophy of the subtle doctor is the understanding of engagement within philosophy. How one little thing makes a difference, and if you move one little thing somewhere else, how it changes other things. Of course, we're left with the question of, do we like Scotus or Aquinas or neither? Or, how is it we're supposed to proceed with philosophy? And we can understand that these engagements, even though maybe over what might appear to be fairly minor points of philosophy, have real lasting impact.